Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Okay. My story's about a Christmas Eve in 1944, a brief moment of peace on the battlefield. A little bit of introduction here. While the Christmas Truce of 1914 has achieved legendary status in the history of World War I, there has been little coverage of similar events involving American troops. When America entered World War I, years of massive casualties discouraged any brotherly feeling between the opposing armies. And the senior officers actively discouraged any repeat of the events of 1914. In World War II, there were very few chances for such events, as American troops were in close contact with German forces only in relatively small numbers. In North America and Italy prior to the 1914 D-Day landings. Any large-scale truce for Christmas 1944 was impossible, as just 9 days prior to Christmas, the Germans lost their largest counteroffensive of the war in the West, resulting in the Battle of the Bulge. Yet while there was no mention of any Christmas truce in the official records, we do have a personal account of a much smaller truce during the height of the fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. This is the story of Fritz Winken, a young German boy at the time of the battle. Fritz, then 12 years old, had moved with his mother to a small cottage in Hürtgen Forest after their hometown of Aachen was partially destroyed in an earlier American offensive. The area had stayed quiet until 9 days before Christmas, when the German Ardennes offensive had crashed through the area. According to Fritz, we heard the incessant bombing and booming of field guns. Planes soared continuously overhead, and at night, searchlights stabbed through the darkness. On Christmas Eve, 1944, Fritz and his mother answered a knock at the door. 3 American soldiers, one badly wounded, were standing there. While the victims did not speak English, nor the Americans German, they were able to communicate in a limited amount with French. Fritz's mother invited the Americans inside and attempted to make them comfortable. Fritz remembered this. We learned that the stocky, dark-haired fellow was Jim. His friend, tall and slender, was Robin. Harry, the wounded one, was now sleeping on my bed, his face as white as the snow outside. They'd lost their battalion and had wandered in the forest for 3 days looking for the Americans and hiding from the Germans. They hadn't shaved, but still, without their heavy coats, they looked merely like young boys. And that was the way Mother began to treat them. Fritz's mother made a meal of potatoes and a rooster, previously being saved for a reunion with Fritz's father. As they cooked, there was a second knock at the door. Expecting to find more lost Americans, Fritz opened the door without hesitation. There stood 4 soldiers, wearing uniforms quite familiar to Fritz after 5 years of war. They were Weimar, Germans. I was paralyzed with fear. Although still a child, I knew the harsh law for sheltering enemy soldiers constituted treason. We could all be shot. The corporal leading the German patrol told Fritz's mother, "We have lost our regiment and would like to wait for daylight. Can we rest here?" "Of course," she replied. "You can also have a fine warm meal and eat till the pot is empty. But we have 3 other guests, whom you may not consider friends. This is Christmas Eve, and there will be no shooting here." The corporal demanded, "Who is inside? Americana?" Fritz's mother replied, "Listen, you could be my sons, and so could they in there. A boy with a gunshot wound is fighting for his life, and his 2 friends lost like you and just as hungry and exhausted as you are. This one night, this Christmas night, let's forget about killing." The Germans stacked their arms by the door, and after a quick conversation in French, the startled Americans also turned over their weapons to Fritz. The entire mixed group, somewhat tensely, sat down and shared dinner, according to Fritz. Now, it seemed like relaxation was now beginning to replace suspicion. Even to me, all the soldiers looked very young as we sat there together. Heinz and Willie, both from Cologne, were a mere 16. The German corporal, at 23, was the oldest of them all. From his food bag, he drew a bottle of red wine, and Heinz managed to find a loaf of rye bread. Mother cut that in small pieces to be served with dinner. Half the wine, however, she put away for the wounded boy. Then Mother said grace. I noticed that were tears in her eyes as she said the old familiar words, "Come, Herr Jesus, be our guest." As I looked around the table, I saw tears too, in the eyes of the battle-weary soldiers, boys again, some from America, some from Germany, all far from home. Just before midnight, Mother went to the doorstep and asked us to join her to look up at the Star of Bethlehem. We all stood beside her except Harry, who was sleeping. For all of us during that moment of silence, looking at the brightest star in the heavens, the war was distant and almost forgotten. The truce held through the morning, Christmas Day, when the 2 sets of soldiers shook hands and departed, each headed back to their own army. It is likely that there were other such small-scale truces, or at least agreements between local American and German units to refrain from attacks and firing on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, perhaps in Italy in 1943, or in quieter parts of the line in 1944. But this is the only documented case currently known. I thought of John 16:33. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So that particular night in a home in the Hurtgen forest, Jesus overcame the world, and there was peace.